In a quiet, peaceful town nestled along a winding river, the name of Reverend Samuel Green carried weight. He was a man of God, a preacher whose presence in the church every Sunday was as reliable as the sunrise. His sermons, filled with wisdom and compassion, brought comfort to many in the community. Samuel had built a reputation as a righteous man, a dedicated servant of the Lord who would do anything to help those in need. People admired him for his selflessness, his commitment to helping the poor, and his role as the moral compass of the town. He was often seen visiting the sick, distributing food to the hungry, and offering prayers to those who sought his guidance. However, underneath this image of devout righteousness, a darker side of Samuel's life remained hidden, known only to a few, if anyone at all. Over the past several months, a strange unease had begun to settle over Samuel's routine. His once regular visits to the elderly and the troubled became more sporadic. He started arriving late to church, offering excuses that did not quite sit right with those who knew him best. His sermons, once filled with passion, began to feel hollow, as though the words he spoke were disconnected from the man delivering them. What no one knew was that Samuel had been frequenting a part of town that was far from holy. A notorious alleyway lined with dimly lit storefronts and shadowy figures was the last place anyone would expect to find the preacher. It was known as a haven for the women who sold their bodies to survive, often called the ladies of pleasure. Samuel had been visiting this alley for weeks, drawn by an irresistible need that he could not ignore. The preacher had sworn to uphold purity and virtue, but the temptation he found in this part of town began to erode his willpower. There, in the company of these women, Samuel sought refuge from the pressures of his role. It was an escape from the expectations placed upon him as a man of the cloth, a place where he could forget his doubts and frustrations. The women, many of whom had turned to the streets after difficult lives and broken dreams, offered him more than physical company. They offered him attention and acceptance, something he hadn't realized he craved so deeply. He would often sit with them in the dim glow of the streetlights, paying for their companionship not just for the night, but for the brief moments when he could pretend to be someone else. Samuel's visits remained a secret. No one in the town knew where he went during the long hours when he disappeared. His erratic behavior was dismissed as exhaustion, and his odd moods were attributed to the weight of his duties. But as the days passed, his obsession grew, and the visits became more frequent. The women of the alley had become more than just his secret indulgence. They had become his silent companions, and over time Samuel's thoughts became darker. One night, after a particularly long and intense session of his late-night visits, a chilling event would occur that would change everything. Lucy, a woman he had become increasingly drawn to, would be found lifeless in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The discovery of her body and the brutality of her murder would shake the town to its core. Samuel's once pristine image was now under scrutiny, and the question began to form in the minds of some: was the Reverend truly the man they had thought he was? The discovery of Lucy's body sent shockwaves through the town, casting a long shadow over the once peaceful community. Lucy, a woman with a troubled past, had found herself living in the darker corners of society. Her life had been marred by choices that left her with few allies, yet she had always been known to frequent the alley where Samuel had begun spending his nights. The town, which had never truly embraced the women of the streets, now found itself forced to confront the grim reality of a murder that hit too close to home. Detective Miller was assigned to the case, a man with years of experience in dealing with crimes that disrupted the peace of small towns. He was methodical, unflinching, and had a sharp eye for detail. From the moment he arrived at the scene, the grisly nature of Lucy's death made it clear this was no ordinary crime. Her body was found in an abandoned house near the river, abandoned but for the trail of blood that led to the doorstep. She had been strangled, her life taken with cold efficiency. No sign of a struggle or forced entry suggested she knew her killer, or at least had not tried to escape. There was something intimate, personal even, about the way her life had been snuffed out. As Miller surveyed the scene, his mind began to piece together the few clues available. Lucy's connections to the street and the known residents of that area were immediately apparent. Yet, there was something more lurking beneath the surface. As he canvassed the area, It became clear that there had been sightings of Reverend Samuel Green near the abandoned house, and several people had seen him at the alley where Lucy and others made their living. The preacher, the man who had always been the town's moral guide, had been seen at these locations late at night, a fact that raised eyebrows. But no one had ever suspected him to be involved in anything more sinister than simple charity work. Miller, despite the shock, did not rush to conclusions. The fact that Samuel had been in the vicinity did not automatically link him to the crime, but the more he investigated, the more the preacher's name kept coming up. Samuel's late-night disappearances were becoming harder to ignore. People in the community had seen him leaving his house in the dead of night, returning in the early hours of the morning, often with a look of guilt or distraction on his face. Some had noticed that his sermons lacked their usual vigor, and his usually pristine image had started to show signs of strain. The once proud man of God had begun to look increasingly frazzled and distant. As Miller dug deeper, he came across a troubling pattern of behavior. Samuel's connection to the women in the alley was not just one of charity or compassion, it had grown darker, more complicated. One name in particular kept appearing: Eliza, a woman who had been working the streets for several months. Eliza had caught Samuel's eye, and from all indications the preacher had become fixated on her. His interactions with her seemed to have crossed the line from benevolent interest to something much more obsessive. The closer Miller looked, the clearer it became Samuel was not just a man seeking redemption for others. He was a man hiding his own personal demons, and those demons were beginning to surface. The connections were undeniable. Samuel had visited the very house where Lucy's body had been found, and Eliza had been seen speaking with him only days before the murder. But as Miller sought further evidence to connect the preacher to the crime, the truth grew murkier. Samuel had left no clear physical evidence behind, and his alibis appeared unshakable. Yet the more Miller learned about the preacher's behavior, the more it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Was Samuel truly capable of such violence? Or was there something deeper, something hidden, lurking beneath his carefully constructed facade? Miller couldn't help but wonder. How many others had seen the preacher's darker side but chose to ignore it? How many had mistaken his kindness for purity, his compassion for righteousness? The deeper Miller dug, the more he began to question whether the man they had all trusted had been wearing a mask all along. As the investigation into Lucy's murder continued, Detective Miller and his partner, Detective Harlow, began to unravel a disturbing truth about Reverend Samuel Green. The evidence that had initially seemed sparse and circumstantial now pointed in one clear direction. Samuel, once the town's spiritual pillar, appeared to be hiding a far darker secret. The more they learned about his private life, the more it became clear that Samuel's connection to the women of the alley was not merely one of charity or occasional visits. It was much deeper, more obsessive, and disturbingly personal. Detective Harlow was the first to notice the pattern in Samuel's behavior. He had been acting increasingly erratic in the days leading up to the murder. Harlow had interviewed several people in the town, and though no one could say for certain what had caused the preacher's behavior to shift, the pattern was undeniable. Samuel had begun distancing himself from his church duties, attending fewer community events, and withdrawing from social interactions that once came so easily to him. His appearance had become disheveled, his sermons lacked the usual fervor, and his once pure demeanor had started to fray at the edges. The detective soon discovered that Samuel had been secretly paying for the companionship of women in the alley. What had started as occasional donations to the ladies of pleasure had escalated into private visits that he kept hidden from everyone, even his closest confidants. Samuel, it seemed, had not been seeking redemption for others, but was instead indulging in his own secret desires, his shameful escapism hidden beneath a veil of virtue. He had been paying for their company, not just for a few moments of companionship, but for their time and attention in ways that blurred the line between charity and obsession. Among the women, one name kept cropping up in the detective's investigation: Eliza. A woman known for her beauty and sharp wit, Eliza had gained Samuel's attention months before. Initially, their interactions had been framed as charity. He would visit her, sit with her, listen to her problems, offering her help and kindness. But it soon became apparent that Samuel's interest in Eliza went far beyond mere benevolence. He became fixated on her, going out of his way to ensure that she received more than the other women. Samuel's thoughts, as it turned out, were far more consuming than anyone had known. Through interviews with Eliza's friends and a few discreet inquiries, the detectives pieced together a troubling story. Eliza had always been wary of Samuel's advances. She knew how to navigate the streets, how to protect herself, and had seen enough men like him to recognize the signs of obsession when they appeared. She had repeatedly rebuffed Samuel's subtle advances, making it clear that their relationship would remain purely transactional. But Samuel, unable to accept rejection, had started to grow more desperate, more controlling. He wanted her to see him as something more than a preacher. He wanted her to love him, to need him as much as he thought he needed her. This obsession, the detectives realized, was more than just a passing infatuation. Samuel's mind had become increasingly consumed by thoughts of Eliza, and when she began to distance herself from him, his frustrations boiled over. The more she rejected him, the more his desire for control over her life, over her fate, grew. His obsession with Eliza became the twisted, driving force behind his actions. He was no longer just a man of God in the eyes of the community. He had become a man consumed by his darker urges, a man capable of violence when his fantasies were denied. The more the detectives learned about Samuel's hidden life, the clearer it became that his connection to the murders was more than circumstantial. It wasn't just about Lucy anymore. It was about Samuel's need for power and control, his desperate desire to break free from the constraints of his own guilt and shame. It wasn't just about Eliza either. It was about his need to possess her, to make her his, no matter the cost. And in the process, the town's reverend had become a cold, calculating man capable of murder. The investigators now had a clearer picture of Samuel's downward spiral. His obsession had driven him to the edge, and the next steps were inevitable. Detective Miller and Harlow were closing in on the truth, but there was still a part of them that wondered, could someone so deeply embedded in the community, a figure so revered and trusted, really be capable of such monstrous acts? The deeper they dug, the more their doubts grew, until they realized that Samuel's true nature was far darker than they had ever imagined. As the days passed, the investigation into Reverend Samuel Green grew increasingly intense. Detective Miller and Harlow had started to connect the dots between Samuel's secret visits and the murders, but the case had taken a new, terrifying turn. The second body, Eliza's body, was found just days after Lucy's murder, and the chilling similarities between the two killings made it clear that they were dealing with something far worse than a random act of violence. Eliza had been brutally murdered, much like Lucy, left in an abandoned house near the river, a victim of strangulation. The crime had been committed with the same coldness and precision, and the detective duo couldn't ignore the fact that Samuel had been near the scene shortly before her death. The timing of Eliza's murder raised alarm bells. She had been the object of Samuel's obsession, the woman he had been fixated on for months. Despite her repeated rejections, he had continued to pursue her relentlessly. The detectives began to realize that the murders were not random acts of violence or the work of a deranged stranger. No, they were personal. And Samuel, the reverend who had once been the town's pillar of faith, was at the center of it all. Detective Miller and Harlow were now convinced that Samuel's obsession with Eliza had reached a boiling point. His inability to control his emotions, his sense of entitlement, and his growing frustration with rejection seemed to have driven him to commit the unthinkable. Eliza's murder was not just about silencing her. It was about exerting control over her, about punishing her for the perceived betrayal of not returning his feelings. Samuel's delusions had taken root, and his need to possess Eliza had become so overwhelming that it had turned deadly. As the detectives pieced together the timeline, they discovered that Samuel had been with Eliza the night before her death. Witnesses had seen them together, and there was no denying that they had been in close contact. But what had happened between them in the hours leading up to her murder remained unclear. The detectives had no concrete proof that Samuel had killed Eliza, but everything about his behavior pointed to him as the killer. He had become a man consumed by his dark desires, a man who had lost all sense of right and wrong. But the lack of physical evidence left them at a standstill. Samuel had covered his tracks well, leaving no fingerprints, no traces of his involvement. Despite the absence of hard evidence, Miller and Harlow felt certain that Samuel was their man. They began to focus on his psychological state, analyzing his recent behavior and the disturbing patterns in his life. They discovered that Samuel had kept a journal, one that chronicled his inner thoughts, his growing obsession with Eliza, and his increasingly twisted sense of entitlement. The journal, when finally recovered, confirmed what they had feared. Samuel had been spiraling out of control for months. His obsession with Eliza had clouded his judgment and consumed his every thought. He had become fixated on the idea of making her love him, and when she had rejected him, his mind had snapped. The journal was the key that finally unlocked the mystery. It contained detailed entries about his visits to the alley, his conversations with the women, and, most disturbingly, his plans for Eliza. He had believed that if he could not have her in the way he wanted, he would take her by force. He had thought about it for weeks, even written about it, but had convinced himself that it was justified. In his mind, his actions were righteous. He was saving her, redeeming her, even though his actions had become nothing more than delusion and madness. With the journal in hand, Miller and Harlow confronted Samuel, but the Reverend's calm demeanor remained intact. He denied any involvement in the murders, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. His obsession had led him down a dark path, and now, as the truth came to light, Samuel could no longer hide behind his facade of holiness. The townspeople were left in shock, unable to comprehend the depth of the preacher's deceit. The man they had trusted, the man they had turned to for guidance, had been living a double life, one filled with lies, obsession, and ultimately murder. As Samuel was arrested and taken away, the town was left to pick up the pieces of the shattered image they had once held of their reverend. The truth about his dark, hidden life had been exposed, and the community would never be the same. They had placed their trust in a man who had betrayed them all, and now, the full extent of his secrets would be revealed in the courtroom. The case, still filled with unanswered questions, had reached its grim conclusion, but the impact of Samuel's actions would haunt the town for years to come. As Samuel Green was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, his once pristine image shattered beyond repair, the town stood in stunned silence. The revelation that their beloved preacher had been behind not one, but two brutal murders had left the entire community in a state of disbelief. How could a man they had trusted so completely, who had guided their spiritual lives for years, turn out to be so monstrous? The answers were uncomfortable, but the truth was undeniable. Samuel had been a man of secrets, driven by obsession and dark impulses that had remained hidden for far too long. The investigation into the preacher's actions continued, even after his arrest, as more details came to light. As the detectives pieced together the timeline of events, it became clear that Samuel's descent into madness had been a slow and insidious process. His interactions with the women of the alley, initially framed as acts of charity, had escalated into something far more dangerous. His obsession with Eliza had consumed him entirely, and when she rejected him, it had sparked a deadly rage that led to her murder. Lucy, the first victim, had been a casualty of that obsession, an unfortunate woman caught in the crossfire of Samuel's twisted mind. Despite the growing evidence against him, Samuel never confessed to the murders. Throughout his trial, he maintained his innocence, sticking to his story that he had been framed, that someone was out to ruin his reputation. But as the days wore on, it became clear that the case against him was airtight. The journal, recovered by the detectives, was the final nail in the coffin. In it, Samuel had written in chilling detail about his thoughts, his feelings, and most disturbingly, his plans for the women. His obsession with Eliza had been carefully documented, and his delusions had grown more apparent with each passing page. He had convinced himself that he was doing God's work, saving the women from their lives of sin, and that his actions, no matter how violent, were justified. The trial was a spectacle, with the entire town watching as the case unfolded. There was no question of Samuel's guilt. The only debate was over his mental state. The defense argued that Samuel had been suffering from a severe psychological breakdown, a product of the pressure of his role as a preacher and the weight of his own personal guilt. They painted him as a man torn between his desires and his faith, a man who had ultimately lost control. But the prosecution painted a different picture, a man who had used his position of power to manipulate and control the women, a man who had become consumed by his obsession and was willing to kill to get what he wanted. The jury found him guilty on both counts of murder, and Samuel was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict did little to bring closure to the town. The people who had once relied on Samuel for guidance now struggled with the betrayal. How could they have been so blind? How had they failed to see the signs? The town would forever be haunted by the preacher's secret life, and the ripple effects of his actions would be felt for years to come. Families who had trusted him to baptize their children, to perform weddings, and to provide counsel now found themselves questioning everything they had believed about him. The reverend they had once held in such high regard had been a monster in disguise, and it shattered the town's sense of security. In the end, Samuel's downfall was a stark reminder that people are not always what they appear to be. The image of the kind, benevolent preacher was gone, replaced by that of a cold-blooded murderer who had used his position of power to hide his darkest impulses. While Samuel paid the price for his crimes, the town was left to rebuild itself, to try and heal from the wounds he had inflicted. But the scars would remain, a constant reminder that trust, once broken, can never truly be restored. Samuel Green's name, once spoken with reverence, would now be spoken in hushed tones, a cautionary tale for generations to come. The preacher's secret life had led to murder, and in the process, it had destroyed everything he had built. And in the quiet corners of the town, people would continue to ask the same question: how could we have missed the signs?